For the artist who does work that is site-specific, there's often the assumption that there's not a lot to see in the studio. This, of course, may be fact, but it's also a myth or an illusion that constituent elements may not be discrete works in and of themselves, and that the artist produces anything in the studio. What else would one do there? Perhaps at one point they would talk on the phone, or listen to music, or check email. On October 14th, 2014, I received an email from Jasmine Raymond, the curator here at DIA Foundation, requesting to meet for a studio visit. I had just returned to New York from New Orleans after realizing the commission for the propositional work, Public Utility 2.0, for the biennial Prospect 3, that was under the artistic direction of LACMA's curator of modern and contemporary art, Franklin Sermons. LACMA is currently under the direction of the former DIA president and director, Michael Govan. Public Utility 2 has been described as a 21st century analog to a work of land art, something that DIA historically has been well versed in. It makes visible an architect's unused television spectrum, both as a material and as a programmable space. The studio visit itself took place on November 17th, and what is visible in my space on 34th Street between 7th and 8th Avenues, a former cold water flophouse that's loaded with cell phone antennas whose air rights were actually sold 7 years ago, is the documentation of Public Utility 2 on a laptop computer, a double portrait, 2 architectural models, a copy of After All that features what has been referred to as my opus, Prototype 180. The models are the part of the work, number 18, that were commissioned by Roger Burgel, the artistic director for the Busan Biennial in South Korea, who is now the director of the Johann Jacobs Museum in Zurich. The models are on their way there now. They were fabricated in the model studio of Diller Scofidio and Renfro in the Starrett Lehigh building in Chelsea on 26th Street, 4 blocks from here. I mention this to emphasize the factual and to map the illusion of a trade route for this talk. The majority of my work takes place in a specific location and utilizes the prevailing conditions of that place that are made visible through a process that may be made public as a performance or remains invisible to the public, yet still may be considered a performance. Fundamentally, the work always begins with the question of what do we consider a work of art. The double portrait on the wall of this room is the same double portrait that hangs on the wall of my studio on 34th Street. The images are one photograph of Fred Sandback that started the series You and We in 1997. The photograph was actually taken in my studio at 480 Canal Street, a place that is now a condominium. I have kept this work on the wall of my studio since moving to 34th Street in 1999 when I went to teach at the University of California at Irvine. This series is the idea of and the actuality of what one would see when they came to the studio themselves. The studio was set up as a copy stand to photograph the visitors with a medium format Mamiya camera that was later upgraded to a Hasselblad. Film was used to shoot with as well. That was all that was available. And it's also a material that has 2 sides. The idea is quite simple. One would even say it's banal. The image of what one sees in themselves and the way in which they are actually seen. There are over 212 portraits in this ongoing series. A selection appeared in a Sopus magazine in 2004. A page is a middle that has 2 sides. Fred Sandback wrote in 1975 that he would rather be in the middle of a situation than over on one side. either looking in or looking out, and that surfaces seem to imply that what's interesting is either in front of them or behind them. On November 18th, Jasmine Raymond wrote to me that after I had arrived for a residence at the Rauschenberg Foundation's residency in Captiva, Florida, where Rauschenberg has his studio, and asked if I would be interested in giving one of these artist-on-artist talks. I responded immediately that it was something that I would love to do, as it's always been something that I've wanted to do since my first visit to DIA in 1991 when I moved to Chelsea. Now remember, in 1991, there was only DIA, the gas station at 23rd and 10th Avenue that we used as our local food store that's now a CVS. I spent a significant amount of time in DIA's Chelsea location. That, in and of itself, foreshadows many things. There then is, of course, the question of which artist you select from DIA's collection. One goes around in circles with this as a process, as there are many artists in the DIA collection that we are well aware of that are remarkable. For a brief moment, I considered treating DIA itself as the institution, comprehensively for the talk, as what other foundation in the world sees their role as enabling artistic projects that might not other be realized. This is something that DIA uniquely has done and will continue to do. Fred Sandback was quoted in 1996 in an article by Bob Colacello that was written on DIA for Vanity Fair magazine. Colacello characterized Fred's work as enigmatic string works naively, and I did say it was Vanity Fair. When asked about being a part of this collection of artists, Sandback wryly noted, "We don't pose for a group photograph." Rather than talk about DIA's collective process or the work of other artists in the DIA collection, I will talk about the work I always wanted to discuss and that has had a significant influence on my own work and life, the work of Fred Sandback. If there's a moment of hesitancy, and my apologies for not making this preamble a Lacanian short session, it's because Fred Sandback was a friend. And it's more of a challenge to make something appear objective that is understood and familiar than something that is not. I would also say that Robert Rauschenberg contributed to the selection of Fred Sandback, as when I was in residence at his studio in Captiva in November and December with 2 musicians, a playwright, 2 painters, a photographer, a mediator/sculptor, a writer, and a writer-sculptor, I brought nothing with me, another subject that Fred and I discussed in great detail. The exception was a set of written notes as studies for 2 pieces that dated from 1999 to make the subjective objective. This work involved the harvesting of nouns from memoirs and autobiographical novels to write a life as an image that resists translation into binary code. It's not JPEGable in its entirety, and the 438 parts actually make one work. It's the imaging of a life as an image of one's own life, where the execution is the idea. The final mining was from Carroll of Knausgaard's book, My Struggle. Knausgaard, like Sandback, is also Norwegian. Why I bring this up is because Knausgaard is able to do something unique in his writing that's similar to Fred Sandback's work. The constituent elements, as details of his life, retain their own autonomy in relation to the whole, and thus create a tension that is actual. It's difficult to do this language, but it's even more difficult to do this with a skein of acrylic yarn to create lines that emanate from points within an interior space. Regardless, it's rare to encounter this in any form and at any moment. There's a consistency and a literalness that is against metaphor. It's not illusionistic. Fred Sandback has done this successfully from the very beginning when he made his outline of a 2x4. As I've said on numerous occasions, and looking at my notes from my conversations with Fred, a work of art that is successful simply makes the viewer aware of their own existence. We know that that work can take many forms, including a drawing in space. I met Fred Sandback in Berlin on Friedrichstrasse in 1997 in front of Hubert Winter's exhibition space, where I went to install the work A Modest Proposal from 1991. This was a two exhibition that I had with the Viennese artist Birgit Jürgensen. Hubert Winter is also Fred Sandback's gallerist, who's had the Gallery Hubert Winter in Vienna since 1971. At the same time that Hubert was incentivized to open a gallery in Berlin, along with other European dealers, as there was an abundance of space post the fall of the Berlin Wall. Numerous buildings were being architected and included designs by Johnson, Libeskind, Piano, Isesaki, Moneo, Rogers, and others. But there was a dearth of galleries and exhibition spaces in Berlin at that time. I had been familiar with Fred's work prior to meeting him with Hubert and had visited his exhibition at Dia on numerous occasions in 1996 and 1997. The first time I actually saw the work of Fred Sandback in person, it made me laugh out loud. It made me laugh from that place of recognition of something that's so difficult, yet so brilliant and simple. It's a similar place that Jonathan Swift wrote about, but in his case, it was in regards to satire, where satire is like the glass of water, where it's not a prop, where one can see through the glass, but simultaneously apprehends their own reflection, making themselves complicit in the work at a particular place in a particular time, aware of their own existence. This is what Fred Sandback's work actually does. So upon meeting him, you can imagine it was both familiar as well as being monumental. Fred Sandback was a great, great listener. He had an eclectic yet considered music collection and shared this with Hubert Winter, Hubert has also been known to DJ on occasion. If one had the privilege of actually knowing Fred Sandback, one would invariably talk about music. This is a Steve Earle song that was covered by Emily Harris.
I remember holding on to you, and all those long and lonesome nights I put you through. Somewhere in there, I'm sure I made you cry. But I can't remember if we said goodbye. But I recall all of those nights down in Mexico, one place I may never go in my life again. Was I off somewhere or just too high? But I can't remember if we said goodbye. I only miss you every now and then. Like a soft breeze coming up from the Caribbean. Somewhere in there I'll break down and cry, but I can't remember if we said goodbye. But I recall all of those nights down in Mexico. That's one place I'll never go in my life again. Was I off somewhere or just too high? But I can't remember if we said goodbye. But I can't remember if we said goodbye.
The actuality of that song is that it's just a song that Fred Sandback talked about. Since 1997, this is the 10th talk on Fred Sandback's work. There will be 2 more talks on Fred Sandback's work later this year at Dia Beacon. The title of this talk is The Actuality of Fred Sandback's Work. This is a talk that is a talk on what Fred Sandback and I actually talked about. This proved to be an even more challenging than discussing the work of another artist. In the presentation, I will privilege the actual, but in a casual manner. There are 3 main areas that I will introduce in relation to the work of Fred Sandback and what we actually talked about. And they'll include architecture, performance and duration, composition, and philosophy. During this talk, you will not see reproductions of Fred Sandback's work. The decision was made to have the work untitled, one of 9 constructions for the Ringe Studio from 1979, installed here at Dia. The work necessitates seeing it in person at a particular place and in a particular time. We're incredibly fortunate to have this work installed in the room with us. I will also present work of my own that could be in dialogue with Fred Sandback's work, and then provide 1 or 2 more additional examples of works by other artists or individuals in other disciplines that accomplish in a similar manner in their work what Fred Sandback's work does in actuality. In 1973, Fred Sandback wrote, "The photographs of the work provide one sort of knowledge about the work, a sort of schema of what it actually is. Beyond that, the pieces are totally contextual, and the photographs are of no interest with regard to that." David Jozelet states in the beginning and end of his text, Reenactment, from 2009,
"Images multiply. Artists are intelligent, but images aren't. They fight by means of proliferation and accumulation, and their inhuman movements are difficult to govern."
I was fortunate to have spent time at the studio in Ringe, New Hampshire. And I would like to thank, first of all, the remarkable explorer and individual, Amy Baker Sandback, for the understanding the importance of having Fred's work installed for this talk. In addition to Jessica Morgan, the new DIA director, Jasmine Raymond, DIA's curator, who invited me to give this talk, Kelly Kevlon, the assistant curator, for her coordination of all things related to this evening and fielding the numerous requests for tickets and seats. Importantly, David Gray for the assistance with the direction of the placement of the work. And Curtis Harvey for taking the time to come down to install the piece from Beacon with additional support from John Sprague, Patrick Heilman, Max Tinon, and the rest of the staff here at DIA. The art historian George Kubler was a professor of Fred Sandback's at Yale and wrote the seminal work, The Shape of Time, Remarks on the History of Things, from 1961. This work, and the time that Fred Sandback spent with George Kubler, was mentioned on numerous occasions in the conversations we had. It was not only Sandback who was influenced by Kubler, but it was also Smithson, Reinhardt, Judd, and Morris, both of whom were his advisors at Yale. I won't go into further art historical, psychological, or biographical detail, as there are numerous resources on Fred's work, including the extensive website, www.fredsandbackarchive.org. The question of actuality and the work of art was introduced by Kubler, and this was based on his mentor at Yale, whose observation and question, the past serves only to know actuality. But actuality escapes me. So what is actuality? As Kubler pointed out, it's nearly impossible to answer the question, and negation may be the answer. Actuality is when the lighthouse is dark between flashes, the instant between the ticks of a watch, a gap that is infinitesimally small but ultimately real. It's the void between events. For Fred Sandback, there isn't an idea that transcends the actuality of the pieces. The actuality is the idea. And his first interests are the construction, articulation, and the definition of particular three-dimensional situations. The novelty of his work as phenomenon is of no concern to his work as an artist.
I don't know what this is, but I'm gonna tackle it. It might choke Artie, but it ain't gonna choke Steiny.
Fred Sandback wrote that interiors are elusive. You can't ever see an interior. Like eating an artichoke, you keep peeling away the exteriors until there's nothing left. Looking for the essence of something, the interior is something you can only believe in, which holds all the other parts together as a whole, you hope. The outside of a building does not reveal what's happening on the inside of a building. And to be in a room with Fred Sandback's work, even in the space, say the size of DIA Beacon, there's the illusion that the works are suspending the entire structure and everything within it, including ourselves. The fact that the walls, floor, ceiling, comprised of concrete, sheetrock, steel, glass, all recede in proximity to the single, doubled, or trebled lines of the Walmart Red Heart acrylic yarn. But just as elusive as interiors are exteriors within a larger context. In 1999, being stuck in traffic on the 405 freeway, leaving Orange County for Los Angeles, provides certain opportunities, and it was there that I conceived of the work Prototype 180, a work that would radiate from an urban point and use policy to make architecture perform by the simple gesture of the 180-degree revolution of a lot in a single-family home that had been unoccupied for 13 years in Houston, Texas. Houston, as many of you know, is the only municipality in the United States without a formal land use policy or no zoning. Prototype 180 is a work that is still ongoing, and I bring this up because it was a work that I spoke about with Fred before it was fully conceptualized in 1999. And following my return from California, our conversations resumed. I was still figuring out what the work needed to be in relation to place and how to make the process, the end result of the rotation in the public, to appear as if it was on the interior of some kind of system. Fred Sandback's work accomplishes this to make the work always reflect back on its own actuality. The work makes a drawing in space where the actuality is the idea that is present in, as he put it, in a pedestrian space. In the same manner that the interior is a necessity to Fred Sandback's work, the exterior is a necessity to my own. There are other examples of architecture that function in a similar manner in other projects, but I want to show two additional projects that I think make this point. One is built, and it's continuously being challenged by the exterior, and there's even evidence that the architect anticipated this. And this would be, of course, Mies van der Rohe's Farnsworth House. And this is from 2008 with the flooding, where the outside is actually on the inside. The other would be the now non-existing building, the Blur building by Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro. There was a commission for the Swiss Expo in 2002 on Lake Neuchâtel. In regards to performance and duration, in 1973, Fred Sandback wrote, "More and more, working seems to be like a performance, not in the sense of presenting a process, but in the conditions required to complete a piece. Some things are done and completed in my studio, but others are ambiguous until done in a particular place." Fred Sandback worked alone. There's a part of the process of his work that could be considered a performance that he himself alluded to. This performance was realized when he went to complete a work in a particular place that would remain unseen. Duration was a consideration in the installation process, as the minimal nature that required a great deal of attention to detail could be actually quite expedient. It could be days spent sitting in a chair and moving around a space until the right conditions were found, or it could be a 30-minute process. Only Fred would know if part of the performance was to temper the expectations of the institution or the individual collector by the protraction of this process. It doesn't matter. There was an understanding about the temporal, and as he put it, the magic of this process that took place, and it was not to be witnessed by a public. At one point, given my own considerations of process and the actual making of a work of art, I considered filming this when we were actually installing the work here. But those that know better and thought, and even myself, I woke up in the middle of the night with the understanding to think, what was I actually thinking? That curtain is something that really needs to remain closed. So this also goes back to architecture and how invisible the making of the process actually is. One may see the framing and cladding and the building is up, but the walls and the interior process remain invisible. Fred Sandback understood this about interiority. What you don't need to see in order to apprehend a building or even a work of art. We also talked quite a bit about that Herzogian moment in a work of art that can make the work of art. And what was meant by this is in taking the making of the movie Fitzcarraldo and the Les Blanc film, Burden of Dreams, where we actually see with Herzog the necessity to build the boat and actually move it over the hill, rather than constructing a model and doing the same thing. It just smells different. This is also what we experience in Fred Sandback's work. In 2005, I was invited to participate in an exhibition in Munich that translates to "We keep working to no longer work" at the Staatlich Museum für Völkerkunde in Munich. Coincident with the invitation, I had inherited a 1985 Buick Riviera from my father, who died in 2001. But I had neither the need nor the place for the vehicle in New York City. This model was voted Motor Trend's Car of the Year in 1985. It's 206 inches long with a wheelbase of 114 inches. The two-door coupe had a 5-liter engine, 8 cylinders, with an automatic transmission, and weighed in at 3,800 pounds, curbside. I elected to use the exhibition budget to ship the Riviera to Germany and park it in the gallery of the museum. When it was determined that it would be nearly impossible, barring a dismantling of the facade, to crane the car in, the next option was to crash the car as an accident into the Baroque neoclassical facade of the Staatlich Museum für Völkerkunde in Munich on Maximilianstrasse, leaving it for the duration of the exhibition and eliminating the need for parking in New York City. I worked with an engineer to determine the speed and angle at which I should approach the museum in order to ascend the building's steep entrance stairs to execute the accident perfectly, and to make the car stop working in reference to the title of the exhibition. For your knowledge, it was 35 miles an hour at an 18-degree angle. As the exhibition approached, the ship's oceanic transit was delayed due to heavy snowstorms in the Atlantic, something like we've been experiencing in New York these days. And I realized that I'd missed the opening. Not that I was really concerned about that, but an early disembarking in Liverpool and a drive through the Channel and across France and Germany seemed the only way by which I might arrive on time. I changed the port of call in my travel arrangements and made an appointment with the director of the Tate Liverpool, Dr. Christoph Grunenberg. But before leaving, I contacted the shipping agent in Liverpool to check on the location of the ship and was told that it had only gotten as far as the eastern seaboard in Nova Scotia, meaning that I would be late regardless, and it was easier to have the car in the country it ultimately needed to be. I switched the port of call back to the original one, which is Bremerhaven on the North Sea, had a note made from the Tate Liverpool that was sent to the Staatlich Museum für Völkerkunde in Munich, stating that the work would be late for the exhibition. I arrived in Bremerhaven 2 weeks after the opening in Munich, picked up the Riviera, drove to Berlin, where I met the art critic and curator, Peter Herbstreit, and the photographer, Elisa de Lucia. We drove together in Munich the next day from Berlin, crashed the car into the Staatlich Museum für Völkerkunde at 9 p.m. while a music performance was taking place inside the museum. No one witnessed the car being crashed into the museum, but the process was understood. 2 additional examples of works where a non-visible performance is a part of and a necessity to the work would, of course, be one, Andreas Sliminski's work, Raising of a Street Lamp for the Placement of a Tire, on November 27, 1996, that was done for Projects Münster in 1997. Sliminski had construction workers lift the streetlight out of the street in order to place the tire around the pole from underneath. He then had the construction workers replace the lamp back into the pavement. Unfortunately, or fortunately, as this was not a work that was on the interior, but in the exterior, the tire was actually stolen. David Hammond stated that the less I do, the more artist I am. We all need to take a note from that. In his infamous work from 1983, Bliz Erd Ball Sale, which is actually a performance that was the sale of the snowballs, but this work also included a non-visible performance in the preparation of the work and the transactions that were actually taking place. So now to discuss both composition and philosophy. John Cage wrote about Terry Riley's 1964 composition in C that it was the most perfect composition, and that this was due, in fact, that the musicians determine what the work will be each time it's actually performed. They choose when to start playing and with what duration of the piece will be. So it's always the same, but it's never the same. Each performance is a new work of in C. So we're experiencing something similar with Fred Sandback's work in front of us, Untitled, from Rindge, New Hampshire, as the work exists at this particular place and in this particular moment. It will be experienced as a new work when it's in a new location, in a new pedestrian space. It's important to look at the certificate of authentication for what it is, a certificate of authentication. It's not a plan per se, or the work of art, but it does indicate where the work may be placed. And transposing this to a new location creates a new work. It will always be a new work and not a copy or a repetition in the same manner that in C is not a repetition. A final example of one of my own works that I've done in relation to the copy, and there have been many, is the work Alas Poor Yorick from 1999 and 2009. The entire text of Lawrence Stern's The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy was copied onto a sheet of paper that was then made into a one-to-one print, following which, 10 years later, at a very specific location in Truro on Cape Cod, the original was actually burned. Every time it's exhibited, a new copy is made and the old copy is actually destroyed. So there's no discernment of the original or the succeeding copies, and nor would this be discernible from an image. This is also why I brought up Rauschenberg earlier in this talk and what he accomplished in the works Factum 1 and Factum 2 from 1957. He made a painting and then he remade a painting that was a copy, but it wasn't copy. It was to be as close to the original as possible. And this still retained its autonomy as a work of art and discernible from the original. Rauschenberg did this as a study, but did not stay with as his friend Sturtevant actually did, starting in 1964. Duration and staying with the copy is what gives the work its relevance, and as Peter Ely points out in the catalog for Sturtevant, with the show that just closed at the Museum of Modern Art, it's hardly that this is also what gives the work its radicalness. Sturtevant's work is necessary to see in person, as is Fred Sandback's. Sturtevant said that the same is the copy, but it's not the same, and how the current speak of our digital work has shifted the object to fit its own representation. As you may or may not be well aware of or get a sense of from the work of Fred Sandback, as his work is not an illustration of anything except for the materials and a drawing in space, as this point has been made repeatedly and intentionally. But Fred Sandback had a substantial background in philosophy that was a shared interest we had, and one that does not illustrate, nor normally does one discuss this in public except in certain circles. In our conversations, we were like two kids in line at the red diaper baby camps when they'd arrive and you'd be lined up and you'd have to state if you were a Stalinist or a Trotskyite. And that would determine what the extracurricular activities you would have. Obviously, we both knew which camp had art. One of our talks that was most memorable centered on Nietzsche and the consideration of the work of art from the maker versus the Kantian position of the disinterested pleasure that engages the viewer. Rather than get into a lengthy discussion of this and disregard that this is a casual talk about the talks that Fred Sandback and I had, I think it's obvious what philosopher's camp the work would actually reside in. So I would just like to end with the necessity of the work of Fred Sandback and how we all see this work and exist in relation to it as a line in space at a particular place and in a particular time. Images multiply. Artists are intelligent, but images aren't. They fight by means of proliferation and accumulation, and their inhuman movements are difficult to govern. You are either on the inside of the can or your likeness is on the outside of the cup. Thank you.
So I just want to say thank you to Mary Ellen for that beautiful lecture. We really appreciate all the generosity and the time that you gave to this, and also allowing us to take time and be with the Fred prints that you brought in for us, and the work. I don't know if everyone was able to see this during the lecture, but if you'd like to come up and view it, you're welcome to. And but before that, we're going to take some questions from the audience, and I'm happy to walk around and field those. But before I do that, I wanted to say a special thank you to Colin. Colin Gilmore was the musician this evening. And he's in town from Austin, is that correct? From Austin. He's fantastic, and if you have the time and you're able to, this evening he's playing at New Blue, and 10:30, is that right? So you should head out if you can. But yes, if anybody has any questions, please raise your hand, and I'm happy to field those. I know it always is too soon after to ask, but I'll let it resonate for a second and see. Anybody? Am I missing anybody? Okay.
Good.
Well, okay, we'll end. Okay, one. I knew it if I waited long enough. Okay, there you go.
Okay, I'm not sure. Let me try to phrase this. Did you have something particular in mind with this? It was almost a non-narrative style presentation with the photographs. I've been thinking recently about sort of when people talk about art, they're asked to talk in a narrative way. Or if they write a proposal, it's in a narrative way. You're asked to create a narrative for your art, which my art and a lot of art just doesn't have in the same way. So I was very intrigued with this choice of style for the presentation. Can you say something about that, or?
Yeah, sure. As with most things, of course, it was intentional. I think that it reflects both, Fred Sandback's work, to go back to the actuality of the work, which is why it's installed, but then to also have that reflect on my own work and process. And so it's not developing, even though there was the one description of the piece from Germany, but it really literally was a car crashed into a museum and nothing more. And having Colin, perform the Goodbye, the Emmylou Harris song, it was nothing more than a song that Fred actually talked about. So the point of presenting and having this great opportunity to speak to a public on Fred's work in relation to my own and others, you want to provide a kind of generosity, but then it's also, it wasn't about telling anecdotes, and the work of art has its own autonomy, right? I mean, it's really the consideration, the point of talking about, and raising Nietzsche in relation to Kant is that, it's the work is either considered from the maker or from the viewer, and I think we can see that very clearly these days in both the types of exhibitions that are being made and the types of work that artists are actually making. So, it is a little bit of that, like you're at the Red Diaper Baby. And those are communist camps that were upstate. And you did have to decide if you were a Stalinist or a Trotskyite. So there's a structure, I would say that there's storytelling, if that's what you mean by narrative, but it's also to impart and, to detail that there have been 10 talks on Fred Sandback, so what can you contribute? I mean, what I could contribute was that I knew him, he was a very good friend of mine, and I knew the work very well, but it was also to treat that subjectivity in an objective manner. That makes so.
Question. In speaking of the void and looking and seeing, how would you describe the relationship, or if you would at all, of Robert Irwin's work with yours and Fred Sandback's?
Wow, that's a good question. Honestly, I can't. I can in knowing Irwin's work, but I haven't really thought of it in relation to my own. Of that sort of genre, if you will, I would say the alignment is, comes out of both the land art movement, but then film as well. So Smithson and, of course, what took place in Judd, but then Michael Snow. I worked with Stan Brakhage when I was, really young, and other other disciplines. The relationship to film and music and literature and other disciplines, including, public policy and architecture. So, I occupy architecture, but I'm not anywhere near an architect, and I teach it, and I am engaged in the discourse, but it's something very different. So, in that sense, with Irwin, there's certainly some parallels. So, I think that's.
We'll take one more?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I'd like to hear some narratives.
Okay. She wants to hear some juicy.
With this incredible artist. Does that not qualify as a question?
No, go right ahead. I have one more question back here, but if you want to, tell us some juicy details, go right ahead.
Martha Claire, I think you know them all. And I honestly, I don't know what you're asking.
You went to the studio. How'd you meet him? You go to the studio, you call, you say, I'm really interested in your work. And so you sit down and he has this yarn. I don't know.
Well, I described that in of being in Berlin for the exhibition that was at Hubert Winter's, and Hubert was an antiquariat book dealer who also dealt in prints and other kind of ephemera, and he was really the first person in Vienna to show the American minimalists. And so he shows, and still shows, Lawrence Weiner, and showed Fred very, very early on. So I had heard, in both knowing Fred's work and then when I started to work with Hubert, Hubert also started to talk about him. And then it really was that meeting in Berlin, and we were also with Ray Learsey, the collector, and somebody else who was working with Fred on figuring out a commission. So it's one of those things where there was a conversation about music. At that point, I think Fred had just gotten Wrecking Ball and brought a copy for Hubert Winter, and so that became a part of the conversation. And then when we were back in New York, of course, then, you set up something, you go to the studio, you see, and the one thing that there wasn't really anything to see in the studio at that point. So similar to what can happen in my own studio, I walked in and I was expecting to see, a drawing in space, of which there wasn't. There was a wall that was filled with gallery announcements of Fred's shows for the year, which I was kind of surprised by. But then in understanding Kubler and how Kubler talks about the artist biography and the materials that actually represent that, it made total sense. And then there were some prints, some other books, and then, of course, the relief pieces that he had started to work on. So, and then I also, at a certain point, had a house in New Hampshire. So that's how we were able to spend time with Fred and Amy and the family in New Hampshire as well. So, does that help?
I'm going to take one more question.
Sure.
Do you want us to?
Mary Ellen, I was reading
Hi.
Hi, how are you? I was reading something the other day, and it was Pessoa.
Yeah.
I guess trying to figure out how he could write a poem based on a theosophist saying there's two forces in the world, one that affirms and one that negates. And it seems so evident in Fred's work and in your work here with shifting, I guess, where the camera is to negate or affirm subjectivity or objectivity. Any of that apply here?
Affirming and negating simultaneously? Or using... yeah, I mean, yes, of course. I mean, I think that the actuality of the work and the idea is the actual work, right? So, when does it get realized? I don't know if this is exactly answering, but I think that the one part of seeing how, like, Fred's work was actually installed, and so there's the temporal is really, really important in that, because you're not making these kinds of works if you're doing, as an artist, all the time, right? So it's really about the conditions of having a particular, place that's at a particular moment where you actually do that. So that, not all the time for myself, but there's a lot of similarity in actually how I work and that kind of improvisational process. But what it normally ends up being for me is something that takes 20 years and involves some kind of moving of some kind of public policy or something that only becomes visible at a certain amount of time. So that interior becomes is taken to the outside of the exterior, and how do you make visible that which is not visible, right? I don't think that answered your question, but anybody else?
Well, thanks again. Thank you, Mary Ellen.
Thank you, everybody.